Welcome back to The Fold. I'm Grace Baldwin, and I'll be your host today. I'm joined today by somebody very special to Good Shepherd, Jemimah Amos, who comes with lots of academic and professional experience. She's also recently completed her PhD, which is an amazing accomplishment. So I'm so pleased to be speaking with Jemimah today about Good Shepherd's commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Welcome, Jemimah.
Thank you, Grace. It's good to be here at The Fold.
Glad to have you. So, Jemimah, what originally drew you to equity, diversity, and inclusion work?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think it's a combination of two things. The first being my lived experience, and it's always looked different. So growing up in Nigeria, what it looked like was being interested in education of the girl child and gender equality, because that was the issue that was most prevalent at the time. And then, of course, when I moved to Canada to do my master's, I had to rethink what that looked like. How would I be? Well, I also studied sociology. So the finding a way or figuring out a way to transfer some of the things that I already knew, but how to make it relevant to the Canadian context, right? So the girl child problem wasn't as relevant anymore. So I had to think of other ways to figure out how I wanted to apply myself. And so part of my education, being a sociologist at the University of Windsor, was that my degree had a very big focus on social justice. When you apply, they make you write a statement saying how what you wanted to study was a direct contribution to social justice. So in doing that process, I had to really think about how my degree was going to be relevant to a marginalized group. And so I thought, of course, immigrant women. It's personal. The political is personal. And so I kind of started on that line as an academic. And from there, I got involved with a few research projects that were kind of geared towards equity-deserving groups. I worked with migrant farm workers. I worked specifically on some projects that were targeted towards African, Black, and Caribbean men in the labor market. And of course, once you start in one project, the opportunity kind of comes up for you to be involved in other research projects. And that's really how it began, just by doing research and doing a lot of anti-racism work at the University of Windsor. And then around the same time, the University of Windsor already had the office of the VP EDI, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And they had a project that required some kind of research lens, but it was specific towards anti-racism. So again, I got the call to come work on that project. And really and truly, that's how I kind of entered into this field of EDI. And so from there, I got another position, and then I'm here at Good Shepherd. So that's really, it's a combination of multiple things, but the research component was really the beginning of finding myself in this field.
I'm always so fascinated to hear about the paths that people take to kind of get to their current careers or where they have found their passion. So thank you for sharing so much about that, Jemimah. I appreciate it. How has your understanding of EDI evolved over time?
That's also another good question. I think at the time that I started with EDI, this was pre-Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that that's really important when you talk about EDI as we have it today. So pre-Black Lives Matter, there were a few institutions, mostly post-secondary, that were already doing EDI. They had established offices and established structures. So there were a few of us already doing that work. And then George Floyd happened in the US. The uproar with the Black Lives Matter movement happened. And with that, we saw an immediate rise in so many institutions and so many organizations wanting to be involved in fighting against racial injustice. And for many, what that looked like was EDI. And so there was an immediate upsurge of just so many people and so many organizations. And it was very much a trend. And of course, we all know what has happened, which over time, that has kind of changed. And so I think for me as someone in the work, my experience has been going through the various stages of what that looks like and for many of us, it's very reactive because we're a part of something that's bigger than us, right? And so that has kind of been, and that has shaped how I even understand the job. So what that looks like for me right now is ensuring that however I view the work or however I have conversations about the work, I make it bigger than whatever the trend is, right? So I always try to take it back to the purpose of doing the work. It's about human rights. When you put it that way, then it's beyond the trend, it's beyond the cycle. If we have a change in political leadership, the work still remains the same and the message is still the same. So that's kind of how I would explain the changes from when I started to where we are today.
That's fascinating. And I think that's a really important lens to put on things, especially something as important as equity and supporting equity-seeking groups to feel included in the workplace, because that isn't just about political trends. That's important for our day-to-day business here at Good Shepherd. Yeah, that's amazing.
I think what's also really important is as people who do the work, we know that this is not new. Like the pushback is not new. If you look at how history has happened, you would realize that there is always a pushback when something big happens, politically or human rights wise. So for us, it's kind of like the part in the cycle that we know historically has always existed. And the way I think about it, it's going to change again. So right now, where things look really dire, for the lack of a better word, we're going to ride out the wave. And then in a few years, things will go back to where we all believe in justice and equity and the like. So that's kind of how I kind of think about it. And then it keeps us hopeful as people who do the work. It keeps us grounded and it keeps us, it's also a realistic way of thinking about it.
I think hearing you say hope, I think that is really important, because I think you're right to use the word dire. I think some days it feels really dark and you don't even want to look at the news anymore. So being able to use hope as a way to continue the work and bring that out in the work that we do at Good Shepherd, I think is really important. Thank you, Jemimah. What does EDI mean in the context of frontline social service provision?
For frontline, I think that's also a very interesting way of thinking about EDI as a concept or as a field or as an office. I think about how we have policies and we have structures, but when I think about frontline, I think about interpersonal relationships and how they're able to translate some of those policies into practice. So, for example, our frontline staff deal with clients. So I think about what that looks like in terms of their day-to-day interactions and how we're able to apply some of the principles of EDI to these kinds of interactions. And I know I've had a few conversations with, I think even yourself when I started earlier on, and how some of the complex relationships that we have with our clients and the level of complexity that provides to our frontline staff. When you're dealing with the kind of clients that we have, you want to provide service, but at the same time, you also don't want to be at the receiving end of harassment or discrimination or racism or anything that doesn't make you feel good or feel dignified. So finding that balance between providing service to our clients, but also protecting yourself. And from an organizational lens, of course, that becomes even more difficult to do. You want to provide services, but you also want to provide protection for your employees. So I think it's a very complex relationship. And I think that outside of Good Shepherd, my experience was in post-secondary, and it was a very different interpretation of EDI. It was a very different interpretation of what anti-racism or anti-oppression looked like. It was almost black and white because we didn't have the same level of complexity that we have here in Good Shepherd with the kind of clients we have. So for me, I think that's even better appreciation of the job and the role and how it looks different depending on the industry.
I think we often talk about how we work in the gray here.
Yes.
And I think that's really where the root of that complexity lies, and finding ways to continue to live out the mission of Good Shepherd and support those who need our help in the community, while also supporting the really hardworking groups of people who work with us. Yeah. Thank you, Jemimah. What systemic barriers most commonly push people into housing insecurity in our community?
I think that in order to answer that question, we have to think of the various institutions and structures that make up our society and how they're interdependent on each other. So housing insecurity as a problem is not a problem in isolation, right? You have to think of all the other structures and how they come together to affect this one institution. So you think of immigration, you think of the educational system, you think of the family as a system, you think of the legal system and the penal system and what that looks like. And then when you look at what's happening in, take for example, immigration, take for example, the labor market, you can see how based on immigration policies or patterns or trends, in combination with a labor market where underemployment and unemployment for specific groups of people is at a high, you can see a direct correlation to how that then impacts housing security for said group of people, right? So take immigrants, for example, either they come as economic immigrants or they come as under the family class or they come as refugees. That already shapes their experience in distinct ways. And then you take, say, for example, economic immigrants who, in theory, have the human capital skills that should allow for a seamless integration into an economy, at least economically, right? They have the education, they have the work experience, they have the language, because these are all criteria in which they were admitted into Canada. But then the reality is that the labor market, there are barriers that exist that mean that a lot of these people are underemployed or unemployed. And so therefore, in a housing market that is ridiculously expensive, they can't afford suitable or accessible or housing that meets their family needs. If you come with 6 children and you're 2-parent household, that's 8 people, right? But you're severely unemployed, you're in some kind of precarious work, it's part-time, it's casual employment, you can barely afford to pay your rent, but you need space for 8 people, you're automatically vulnerable to be insecure in terms of housing, right? So that's one example of how the various institutions work together. And so housing insecurity is not only about housing, it's about how all these structures come together to shape the experiences of people. But then from an EDI lens, the question then becomes, what groups of people are more vulnerable or are disproportionately vulnerable to housing insecurity? And that's kind of how I think, as the person doing EDI and the person that's worried about justice and equity and all those really good things.
I think you've done such a great job there, I think, unpacking a lot of really complex topics and relating them to the work that you do here at Good Shepherd. You should be a teacher or something, I think,
I've heard that a
lot. You have a real knack for that. I appreciate it. And I'm sure our listeners will as well. How do EDI frameworks help or sometimes fail to help address root causes of oppression like poverty, colonialism, racism? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I can. EDI frameworks, when I think about EDI frameworks as someone in the role, I think one of the very first thing that comes to mind is understanding why or how systems of oppression exist in the first place. I think you really need to understand the why before you can then go about trying to apply any kind of framework, right? So I spoke earlier on about the various systems of oppression, racism, gender or sexism, what that looks like. colonization, the history, but also the ways that it currently exists in our society and what that looks like. So a lot of the work that EDI frameworks try to do at the root is to highlight ways that these systems continue to exist. They are not historical in any sense. When we think about, even when we do land acknowledgements, and I think I saw somewhere, and the land acknowledgement said something about the history of oppression and the history, kind of talking about the dispossession of land in a historical way, as opposed to something that just still happens, but it looks different, right? So I think part of the work that EDI frameworks really do is highlight how systems of oppression still exist, how they don't happen in isolation, how they shape each other. And so if you're going to do any kind of meaningful work that leads to change, you have to first of all understand the roots. So we're thinking about the root causes of poverty. You have to think about the racialization of poverty. You have to look at the gendered aspect of poverty and what that looks like. We just spoke earlier about immigration and how sometimes those barriers that exist automatically lead a particular group of people to poverty, right? So these are ways to understand, to unpack the systems. And with EDI frameworks, for example, if you take intersectionality as a theory, I know it's more of a sociological theory, but there are EDI frameworks now that argue for you to use an intersectional lens into any kind of policy or any kind of initiatives that you're doing, right? And to explain it just real quick, it's just the idea that for intersectionality, there are multiple systems that exist. When you belong to multiple marginalized groups, your experience is shaped by all the systems. So as a Black woman in a place of employment, you are not only a woman, you're a woman and you're Black. And maybe you live with a disability, visible or invisible. Maybe you're neurodivergent. And so if we're making initiatives and we're making action items that only address one inequality at a time, then we fall short. If we're looking at gender or the gender pay gap, and we only want to address the experiences of women, then we've missed out on how to address the issues that racialized women experience. So that's just an example of how you think about EDI frameworks and how they try to address at the root, what's at the roots of these issues, right? And so when you think of EDI, and this is kind of a tangent, but when you think of EDI initiatives or EDI as a field, then you can see how it becomes bigger than a one-time thing. Something that is trying to address the root cause of an issue, something as big as racism, requires efforts that match the problem, if that makes sense.
It does.
Then it's no longer a one-time initiative. It's not a nice to have. It then becomes something that we collectively understand as important and as bigger than the program or than any of us. Yeah.
And I think with such a big goal and something that is so important, I imagine that sometimes there can be a bit of a gap between where we would like to be in practice and where we are in reality. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think it's also really complex because I think we need a lot of education on what some of these things are. One of the very frustrating things that as a person in the job I have to deal with every day, or not every day, but have to deal with quite often, is having to dispel, I guess, some of the misconceptions or some of the myths that people have. So what I was saying earlier as about it being a one-time thing or a nice to have is incorrect. And so what I try to do now in my conversations is to fall back on the legal system, because I think that's the foundation of this whole conversation. Yes, EDI is catchy, but I think at the root of it is really a human rights issue. So what I do now is that I frame all my conversations in terms of the Canadian Human Rights Act, the Ontario Human Rights. What does the C stand for? I don't remember. The code, thank you, right? And the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act. That way, we're reminded of what this is about. And hopefully we have enough momentum to keep going. It's complex. It's even more complex when you think about how much more diversity we have, how much more difference we have, and how much more we need everyone to be on the same page in terms of what's important and what that looks like. So going back to social justice as a basic principle of EDI, I don't think it's negotiable. And I think once we collectively agree that, yes, we are all working towards social justice, then I think we can start to see more progress being made.
Absolutely. And I think that's how we maintain our hope, right? Is that we can point out those small moments of progress and recognize that we're moving in the right direction.
I think so too.
Yeah. Jemimah, what are some of the most common misconceptions that people have about EDI work within an organizational framework?
Oh, that's a big one. There are so many. What I was saying earlier about it being a nice to have, it being a one-time thing, depending on if the motivation for it was strong enough in the first place. The other thing that I think about is I think it's called the myth of meritocracy. And it's the idea that success is dependent on your individual traits as a person. So it's kind of a long-winded answer, but stay with me. Going back to the human capital theory, where you say that people have skills, in this case, immigrants, they have skills, their education, their work experience, their language proficiency that ideally should make them successful upon arrival, right? That's meritocracy. People have the skills, they have the tools, they have the ability. Where the idea of the myth comes in is that in thinking about it that way, you've completely removed the argument of barriers and systems like racism and sexism and all those other things that we know impede the ability for people to then go ahead and be the best version of themselves, right? So the idea that EDI is unjustly awarding people certain positions or certain, achievements or awards on the sole purpose of their minority identity. So the argument that this person got the job only because she's Black, I think is ridiculous. Because, and so how I like to reframe it is that you have to think of EDI as trying to highlight the barriers and trying to address the barriers as opposed to trying to just give away things to people who do not deserve to get those things, right? Because if you examine, and whenever people say this, I always ask them, like, when you say this thing about how, EDI is just unjustly like trying to, employ Black people as an argument, right? Are you aware of whether or not they are qualified? Like, are you aware of their level of education? Are you aware of the work experience that they have? Because I think that them being employed because they're Black does not negate the fact that they're most likely qualified. It's still a business at the end of the day. I don't think that organizations just hire people because they want to be nice, because the person is Black. It's still a business that needs qualified people. So I think that's one of the big misconceptions that really bothers me, because I think that distracts from the work we're trying to do. That takes the conversation away from the actual barriers that we need to address. We're so bothered about how people that don't deserve to be there are getting there. and then forgetting that there is a bigger problem that we need to address. So I think that's one of the few things that I hope. It's also misinformation. It's also sometimes people who also don't even want to hear an opposing, rebuttal to those ways of thinking. I think sometimes it's also just a way to ensure that the status quo remains, unfortunately. And so that means we have more work to do.
That's right. It means that we're always having the wrong conversation.
Yes.
And it's interesting to hear you say that's something that bothers you, because as you were talking, I wanted to ask you, and I hope it's okay.
Yeah.
Like, do you ever get frustrated?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It's always frustrating. It's always frustrating because as the person in the job who sees, I guess, all of the various problems, sometimes it doesn't feel like we're moving as fast as the problem is moving, right? So we're making progress. Yes, we're making progress. But sometimes I feel like it's not happening as quick as it should in response to the problems that we're experiencing. And then when you now couple that with conversations that, quite frankly, we shouldn't be having, and things that just take away from the actual work that we're trying to do, things that are detractors, then it becomes even more frustrating. And then, of course, you think about the climate that we're in, the cuts, all the various things that then now try to take us, 10 steps back. It's extremely frustrating. Yeah.
And then how do you handle that? What are the things that you do to kind of work through those feelings? Because, it definitely doesn't come out when you're at work.
No, it doesn't come out. No, I spent the most part of last year in therapy just ranting about my job. I'm not joking. Just ranting about the state of, not necessarily my job, but the state of the world. Unfortunately, it's a double-edged sword. I'm unable to remove myself from, I guess, the reality that we all live in, which is why I also do the work. But it also means that I'm deeply affected when things like this happen. Right? So I spent a lot of time in therapy going through it. Self-care. Part of my work for last year was just ensuring that I had a self-care plan. And so what I try to do is I also try not to take on too much. And that has just come from years of doing the work. I think at the beginning I was very, oh my God, we need to do this. We need to achieve this. There's so much that needs to be done. And I had a plan, but I didn't necessarily have the support to achieve those things. And so it felt like I was failing, as opposed to, no, you don't have the structure to achieve these goals. Be realistic with yourself and what you can achieve, right? So self-care, and I think just that internal voice of, okay, this problem is going to exist if you're not here, so you have to take care of yourself, basically. Yeah. And I try to speak with other people that are doing EDI work. I go to any EDI conference I can find, just because then you're surrounded with like-minded people. Yes, we complain, but we also encourage each other. So it's a mix, it's a balance, I guess.
That's great. And thank you for sharing that. And I hope that wasn't too personal of a question, only because I think lots of other people probably feel similar ways. So if someone can kind of take a piece of what you've done and apply that to their own day-to-day, I think that would be really helpful. So thank you for that, Jemimah.
Of course.
How do you measure whether EDI efforts are improving people's experiences? And what does day-to-day success in EDI look like?
I'll start with the first one, measuring success. There've been a lot of conversations about data. And when we were talking earlier on about framework, thinking about data and thinking about measurement and thinking about accountability. And when I say data, it can look different depending on the organization, depending on the level that you're in terms of your EDI journey. For example, people who have been doing EDI for 20 years already have like a what's that thing called? A self-identification survey deployed, which they then use to set targets and set goals, and they can clearly identify what they want to achieve from a data-driven standpoint. In the absence of that, there are still other ways to gather data. We have the employment engagement survey, we have staff satisfaction survey, we have other mechanisms of feedback. That's all data that you then use to inform and measure, right? But it's a long journey. So when you start off, what you're doing is you're establishing a baseline, and then over time, you kind of build on that. And so what we've done in the first year and a half is try to establish a baseline in Good Shepherd and what that looks like. And then as the years go by, we continue to measure and compare to how we've done in the past. So it's really data, I would say, and it can look different. It can be, what are those things called when you have a group of people in a room and they ask questions?
Like the focus group.
A focus group, yes. Something, it doesn't always have to be surveys. It could be qualitative data. It could be feedback. It could be conversations that you have that then inform your objectives and you measure success through that. But it's over time. It's over time.
Can you share an example of a change that you've seen, whether big or small, that you feel's made a difference?
I think specifically coming back home to Good Shepherd, this is prior to the creation of my role. There was an equity audit that was conducted with an external organization. And one of the things that came out from that audit was the creation of a 3-year EDI action plan. I think that was a big step in terms of change and in terms of success, but also trying to establish a structure, because one of the recommendations that then came out from that audit was the creation of my role, the role that I occupy now. And so for me, that was a big step. And even in the work I do now, I refer to the results from that audit because that was our one example of data, right? They had an opportunity to conduct a survey and interviews with multiple people in the organization. And so I go back quite often and I look at the results and it informs the work that I do now. But I think it was also a very big step and a big reflection of the commitment that the organization, the direction that the organization is trying to move towards in terms of EDI. I think that was a very big step.
And I think we've touched on this a little bit and some of the things that you've done to sort of take care of yourself and to set yourself up for success. But could you share an example of something that motivates you to continue this work?
I think for me, what motivates me, I think lived experience. I think the personal is political, the political is personal. It's a feminist quote that has always stayed with me. I think someone has to do the work. And I think that the combination of my education, just being a sociologist and studying sociology at the 3 levels of, higher institution, it's my bread and butter. And so for me, I think it's a combination of those things, the lived experience, the work that I do, but also having the education. So having the theoretical knowledge to be able to do the work in a way that makes sense, I think motivates me. So the way I think about it is someone has to do the work. I have the education, I have the skills, I might as well do it. And I enjoy it. So what a bonus.
I think that's great. And what a blessing for us.
What a blessing. I know. So the idea that what I studied, I actually enjoy what I studied. And then I'm able to work, and my research is also related to what I do for work. And so they're not separate in any way. I think for me is really, really, it's a blessing. Yeah, it's a blessing.
And as your colleague, I can say that you are exactly where you should be, and we're very lucky to have you. And we know it's a work in progress, always day to day, but thank you for sharing a little bit about your work here at Good Shepherd and your lived experience and your research, Jemimah. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you. I had a good time.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.